Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Branches of Wisdom, the Banyan Books podcast. I'm your host, Ross McKeechee, and very excited about our guest this evening, Matthew Remski. Before we get into his introduction, acknowledging that although we have people joining from all over the world for these live stream events, the physical location of Banyan Books and Sound is on the traditional and unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Most of Banyan's podcast and event series are free. However, we welcome your donations to keep these programs accessible for all. Just click on the PayPal link in the show description below. Also, towards the end of our conversation today, we will take questions from the live audience. We also want to let people know that some of the content in this discussion today could be triggering as it explores the topics of physical and sexual abuse, cult dynamics, and high demand groups. If you are triggered by anything we discuss here today, please be sure to reach out to a trusted friend, family member, or mental health professional. Our guest today, Matthew Remski, is an author, freelance journalist, and co-host of Conspirituality Podcast, with bylines in the Walrus, Jen by Medium, the Boston Globe, and the Globe and Mail. Remski is a yoga practitioner who writes about yoga, abuse, and cults. His work is informed by his experience as a member of multiple cults. He's published 8 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, including Threads of Yoga, a remix of Patanjali's Sutras with commentary and reverie. In 2023, he co-authored Conspirituality, How New Age Conspiracy Theories Became a Health Threat. His book, Practice and All Is Coming, Abuse, Cult Dynamics, and Healing in Yoga and Beyond, has earned international praise as a groundbreaking resource for critical thinking and community health. Today, Matthew Remski is with Banyan Books in conversation about the new edition of that book, which is called Surviving Modern Yoga: Cult Dynamics, Charismatic Leaders, and What Survivors Can Teach Us. Grounded in investigative research and real survivor stories, Surviving Modern Yoga uncovers the physical and sexual abuse perpetrated by Ashtanga yoga leader Pattabhi Jois and reckons with the culture, structures, and mythos that enabled it. The book also includes practical tools to help readers understand how high-demand groups trap would-be targets, evaluate their own situational vulnerabilities, learn to listen for loaded red flag language, and cultivate their literacy of cult tactics. If you'd like to learn more about today's honored guest, you can visit his website, which is matthewremski.com. Banyan community, join me in a warm welcome for Matthew Remski.
Hello. Hey, thank you, Ross.
Hello.
Yeah. Thank you for
really nice to have you.
Yeah.
Oh, my pleasure. Yeah, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Yeah, a very important topic, and something that you've been working on for how many years now?
I would say we're in about year 8 or 9, something like that. Yeah.
So maybe the best place to start, Matthew, is making sure we're setting a helpful tone and context for having this kind of conversation about high demand groups and cult dynamics. Can you give us a few pointers for the best ways to approach these topics so as not to alienate or feed polarization?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with. Maybe the best question, because I would say that we're living in what I would call like a fool's golden age of cult journalism, streaming, bingeable documentaries, discourse, and I would say trauma porn. And the key themes and impacts I see are the commodification of trauma stories, sensationalism, and distraction. So the main bullet points I would have for avoiding alienation and polarization would be to remember that people who get caught up in high demand groups are just like you, that their situational vulnerabilities aren't just psychological, they're not just daddy issues. There can be class, race, gendered, or disability vulnerabilities as well. On a related note, online cultic movements like QAnon thrive in demographics that are socially and economically immiserated. Conspiracy theories are very attractive if it feels like capitalism is out to get you, which I think is reasonable for people to feel. QAnon, as we know, didn't have the same impact in Canada, in part, in my opinion, because of socialized medicine. People should also know that, leaders of high demand groups learn to manipulate and sometimes get away with crimes, but they're not necessarily malignant or evil. They might be self-selected for powerful personality traits or even neurodivergencies. The thing that we have to remember is that they exploit holes in the social fabric. I think also we should remember that being in a high demand group may not be the worst possible thing that could happen to a person. But it does make sense that anti-cult activists would promote this idea to the extent that, they need to market their own solutions. But the thing is, sometimes joining a high demand group is a step up from being in a truly cursed family or church or marital situation. And I think on that note, we can also keep in mind that while, the experiences and relationships within a high demand group can often be toxic, authoritarian, and exploitative, some people experience within these groups states of connection and even love that they've never known before. And that is what makes it so hard for them to reckon with the abuse. And it makes it hard for them to leave. So I think, in general, there's a lot at stake in how we look at exploitative groups, because that's going to reflect how we look at society in general and how we approach social reform, equality, and protecting ourselves against capitalism.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's such a nuanced and sensitive issue, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that what we tend to do with the sensationalization project is we externalize the notion of the scary or the oddball situation that winds up being somehow outside of society, and that's a distraction from what's actually going on around us all the time. And so, to the last point that I made, is that if you're living in capitalism and you're not part of the 1%, you are involved with, you are implicated in, you are, subject to high demand exploitation. It's happening to you on some level. If you don't feel it, it's probably the effect of some kind of class or racial or gendered privilege. There's always a drive to consolidate power to the top. There's always misogyny, rape culture, wage theft, theft of emotional labor, and a multitude of cultural and spiritual rationalizations for it. And there are always charismatic leaders who will rely on, us not seeing them as the anxious and fragile little boys that they are. So yeah, I think it's really good to step back from sensationalism, from the commodification of cult literature in the vein of true crime, and to recognize that, yeah, high demand situations are basically the water that we swim in if we're swimming in capitalism.
Right, right. And the charismatic leader that this book focuses on is Pattabhi Jois.
Right.
I think most people in the yoga world probably already know about the abuses that of Pattabhi Jois. But for those who may not know, can you just give a little bit of an overview of who Jois was? What is the Ashtanga yoga brand or tradition, and what were the nature of his abuses?
Yeah, so Joyce was born in 1915 to a fairly poor Brahmin family in a small village in South India. And at 12, a guy named Tirumalai Krishnamacharya rolled into town and began giving yoga posture lessons to the boys there. And the most notable thing that Joyce says about that first encounter was that Krishnamacharya beat the boys severely when they couldn't perform adequately. But nonetheless, he was attracted by the discipline and by the contact with this, charismatic teacher. And so he eventually ran away to Mysore, where Krishnamacharya had set up a gymnasium type school under the auspices of the Maharaja of Wadior, who is one of the wealthiest men in the world at that point, and quite a liberalizer and a westernizer of public education, especially in that part of the world. And Joyce studied yoga practice, but also things like Sanskrit at that place for years. And by the 1930s, the end of the 1930s, he's teaching Sanskrit at the Mysore Palace. And then by the late 1950s, he's also teaching yoga fitness type classes to the businessmen of the Mysore High Street. Now, my understanding is that it was never really a very religious or spiritual activity until the Westerners started showing up. So first of all, in 1964, there's this Belgian guy, André van Lessebeth, who arrives and he writes a book about his encounters with Joyce and how he learned yoga. And then American dropouts find this book and then sort of pour towards Mysore in search of Joyce. And over time, in response to this demand for a kind of spiritualized physical practice, Joyce developed this very challenging form of yoga that his foreign students began associating with ascetic purification. And he also made it standard to manhandle bodies into postures, as his own teacher did. Now, Joyce's students seem to relish the idea that if the body could be stretched and torqued until you felt like boneless, soaked in sweat, that like God would just flow through you. And so there was the pain of the postures, but then there was also the pain of the adjustments, which I think we can now characterize as assaults. It was just implicit and known that, Joyce would force you into postures. And over the years, it became the heart of the draw to his shala or his studio. Students would have to be adjusted by him for months at a time in order to progress towards becoming teachers themselves. So here's the content warning for sexual assault. What this scenario allowed Joyce to do, for whatever reason, whatever issues he had, he was simply able to do this as he applied his full body weight to people in super vulnerable positions. If they were women, he would grope them or even openly hump them. There was a famous move called the Mula Bandha adjustment, which involved Joyce, checking to see whether the perineum was engaged, whatever that means. And that involved him literally pressing his fingers through the tights into women's vaginas. And so this was a form of digital rape. And most of this happened in the open. Many people saw it. And most senior students, all Westerners, by the way, ignored it or rationalized it. So I spoke to women who were told that they were making the assaults into something dirty through their imaginations. Women who were told that even if they were telling the truth, that Joyce was like this tantric level spiritual teacher. And so the assault was actually a spiritual teaching for them, that he was reorganizing their energy or their spiritual bodies or helping them with sexual trauma. And some senior students were aware of these crimes to the point that they really, were disturbed, but they also felt confused and powerless when it came to intervening. And that's where the cult dynamics in the subtitle of the book come in.
There's a longer quote that I have here, Matthew, from the book, and it relates to a couple of things that have already been mentioned, and maybe we can go a little bit deeper. One of the new things that gets introduced is your personal experience with corporal punishment in Catholic school. So I'll read the quote, and then we can attend to the question. So you write, "I grew up in an all-male Catholic school environment where corporal punishment was one of the primary ways in which the social hierarchy was organized. On a daily basis, I was either receiving corporal punishment or watching it being administered to boys like me. As I researched the histories of the men who brought yoga to the non-Indian world from the 1960s onward, Pattabhi Jois, BKS Iyengar, Bikram Chaudhuri, and others, it became clear that this was a formative experience in their boyhoods as well. They all describe being physically abused while learning to do yoga."
Yeah. Yes. Well, St. Michael's Choir School here in Toronto, and corporal punishment was outlawed by the city here in 1971, but they just didn't give a shit about that. And a note about language, actually, it's interesting that this is the second edition. Should there be a third edition? I don't think I'll use the term corporal punishment anymore. I think I'm just going to call it child assault.
Right.
Because punishment implies that there's something to be punished or that it works. Corporal is just a weird kind of Victorian word that I don't. Anyway, we're talking about child assault. Like there's no other way of putting it. And when we speak about the physical assaults and adjustments in early modern yoga, I think what people have to understand is that these interventions were indistinguishable from child assault in Tirumalai Krishnamacharya's Yogashala. Because the basic premise is that the child's body, should be forced to comply with something and then punished if it can't do that thing. And I want to be very clear that this is totally new in the history of yoga as of the 1930s. There's no history of teacher-student physical contact in yoga before this era. Now, some Ashtanga and Iyengar devotees will call the adjustments traditional, but it's not true. What they're really saying is traditional becomes this way of saying he's strict, he's conservative, he's unyielding, right? And those things are all true, but there's no sort of like lineage or history of practice. This really comes through the conjunction of European nationalistic gymnastics and calisthenics classes, along with the way in which they were taught in public schools in Europe, influencing these Indian proto-nationalists who wanted to create a kind of physical fitness system that they could then indigenize as Indian with memories and resources from Hatha Yoga's past. So prior to this, physical yoga was practiced alone, no concern given to how the posture looked. And I think that the upshot is, and I guess I realized how deep to the bone this went because of my own experience when I finally looked at the most famous photograph in, I would say, yoga history, which is of BKS Iyengar standing in mountain pose or Tadasana. And he's standing ramrod straight with his hands rigidly pointed, fingers rigidly pointed downwards towards the earth, his chest, his barrel chest puffed out, very stern face. And you can see it's not only sort of a medical style anatomical posture, but it's also a military posture. It's a soldier's posture. And it's the posture I could see. This is kind of intuitive. It's the posture of somebody who is trying to stand upright or else. The posture of somebody who's trying to be perfect, because the consequences of not being perfect, of not being perfectly aligned or perfectly erect, are going to be physical violence. And I think that when that connection finally got made, and then I had a number of encounters with Iyengar teachers for whom physical adjustments felt like assaults or punishments, um, things came together. And I could see that this process of intervening in students' bodies has this very old, punitive, intrusive root. And, it's not like people are outright beating, kicking, and slapping, as they called BKS Iyengar in his glory days, in yoga studios now throughout the world. But to the extent that teachers are adjusting students without knowing why, or without full consent, or with this sort of premise that they know how a student's body should be organized in space, they know the student's body better than the student does, then that influence is still with us.
Yeah. This brings me to my next question. You refer to people like Pattabhi Jois, Yogi Bhajan, Swami Vishnu Devananda of Shivananda Yoga, and I'll quote you. You say that these and other deeply wounded megalomaniacs were at the center of the 1960 to 1990 global yoga expansion period and its professionalization. I'm really interested to hear your take on how the approach to yoga that was presented by these megalomaniacs became the popular forms of modern yoga that we see around North America, I think Europe, most of the Western world.
Yeah, well, you can tell by my language that sometimes, I'm not the most popular person on Facebook, but these are three very different guys, but they shared an unchecked overconfidence in their own skills and importance, to the point that each of them had no qualms about exploiting pretty much everyone around them for their own purposes. So that's the abusive personality. There are cultic dynamics that facilitate it. And then each one of them left a trail of survivors of physical, sexual, financial, and child abuse behind them. And also, just let me go back to the top and remind everybody that that's not the entire story. What makes their group so complicated is that many members also feel that they received incredible life-changing benefits from those methods. So it's not like some sort of infernal, all criminal activity, situation with these groups, but they definitely abuse the people around them, and then their sort of inner circle and then the outer circles might have facilitated more positive experiences for those beyond. Now, for the yoga enthusiast who never met these guys to be able to form an impression, what those people have, it's most of the yoga practicing world, is they have contact with the methods. And the methods are attractive because I believe they delivered worlds of complete answers within a complicating, modernizing environment. Each of these guys promised a whole package, a total relief from modernity and the complexity of science. They offered a new spirituality for the disenchanted, for the spiritually lost. They offered the promise that yoga would heal anything and everything. And it came at a very opportune time, because it's not accidental that this influx and explosion of yoga entrepreneurs begins to gain traction within North America and Europe at the end of the 60s and the early 70s. many of the students that begin to throw themselves into, personal development and self-care and spiritual practice are not just spiritual seekers, they're also recovering from the disappointment of a failed social revolution. Okay. So, what happens? uh, do the protests end the Vietnam War? No, not really. Um, uh, are civil rights fully enshrined? Uh, Almost, but there's so much work left to do. Um, can we feel the neoliberal age of austerity approaching in the 70s and the 80s? Yes, everybody can. And so there's a kind of despondency that a number of sociologists point to and historians that comes out of this feeling of, well, Paris 1968, where did it really get us? Underneath the stones, the beach. Did we really find the beach? Well, no, we didn't. I guess we'll try to brighten the corner where we are. Sam Binkley has an amazing book called Getting Loose, which is, the subtitle is very long. It's like Lifestyle Capitalism in the 1970s or something like that. And his premise is that in the sort of afterglow of the promise, the fading promises of the 1960s, there was a trend towards individualization, individual self-actualization that became the kind of focus of what used to be the counterculture. And that individualism, that kind of medical experimentation leading to a kind of medical libertarianism, these are at the roots of the yogic and the alternative health movements, emerging antipathy towards public health, which of course exploded in full force during the pandemic. That's a whole other story. But I think what the purveyors of this first wave of Indian gurus really offered people was a kind of solution at the end of a long series of disappointments. And I think maybe I'll sum it up by just reminding everybody who's listening that the person who opened the Woodstock Music Festival in 1969 was Swami Satchidananda, who himself would go on to be accused of multiple counts of abuse by his students, but who really grounded the Woodstock vibe in this spirit of universalist self-regard, right? I think he even says something like, everybody is shouting for peace, or everybody's fighting for peace. Why should we fight for peace when we can find peace within? And then he chants Om. But not only does he chant Om, he chants the holy name of Ram, which then, decades later is being chanted by Hindu nationalists as they rip down the mosque where in Ayodhya. So there's this very strange set of political intersections that sort of arrive there on that hill in 1969 with, the yogi who seems to be offering a universalist message of peace, but he's doing so by actually encouraging people to depoliticize themselves, to stop protesting, really, to enjoy the vibes, to start to get loose. And what they don't recognize is that he's coming from a strongly Hindu nationalist culture that isn't really interested in peace, love, and happiness itself. It has its own ideas about order. So there's a number of answers that these entrepreneurs offer, and they all arrive at the end of the 1960s. And yeah, the kids take it up. like fire.
Does your mind ever get boggled by trying to manage and sift through all of the information?
At first, yeah. I mean, I think when I have the advantage of enough time to absorb the historical and sociological resources, then I'm good. Then I can see it kind of fit together. Although, like, in an abrogated form, right? Like, the little sort of speech that I just gave is leaving out way more than it's offering. So I just want to be clear about that. I'm not some sort of, mastermind historian, but I think that it's a few of those details are really beneficial for trying to understand, like, why this material was just so attractive. Like, what made the culture so hungry for it? Oh, and there's one more thing that I want to add, which is that, and I cover this in the book pretty extensively, Joyce's students and Iyengar's students as well were fascinated with the seeming harmony and dignity of the Brahmin family, the families that they came from. So there's a kind of traditionalism that I think became very appealing to people who had just fallen out of the 1960s and perhaps the disappointments or the failures of in their minds of the sexual revolution. And suddenly they find themselves in India, watching Pattabhi Jois's wife prepare traditional food for him every day, and he's doing arti every morning in front of the family temple. And there's a sense in which these kind of American dropouts are really attracted to some sort of traditional gender essentialized family form that makes sense to them, or gives them a feeling that maybe society isn't completely falling apart, or that maybe order can be restored in their own domestic souls or something like that. So this begins to account for some of the very misogynistic, anti-feminist views within yoga culture. Also, the the deep gender essentialism that begins to focus not on equality between the sexes, or not on the sort of the fluidity of gender, but on the divine masculine and the divine feminine. So there's a way in which a number of aspects of Indian culture provide the opportunity for American and Canadian and European travelers to kind of indulge themselves in a reactionary politics, believing that it has some sort of spiritual merit. So that's another thing that I wanted to throw in there that made it very attractive, I think.
Right. Okay. Yeah. This it fits well with the next question I want to talk to you about. It. I don't have the full quote from Kino McGregor, but in the book, in reference to something that Ashtanga celebrity Kino McGregor said in defense of the Ashtanga community, you point out that she conflated, quotes, that portion of the Ashtanga world that abused and enabled abuse with the, quotes, spiritual lineage of yoga in general. This is a really important point. I'm wondering if you can speak to this phenomenon of how I'm going to call authentic yoga, just for the best term I could think of, can be grouped in with these schools where there has been some form of distortion or warping that's gone on.
Yeah. So it's fairly common for defenders or people who are, I empathize with Kino McGregor struggling to absorb the news of and the revelations, to the extent that she wasn't aware previously how deep the stories went. I empathize with the struggle to come to terms with having idealized this person, having called them, having called him, he was like my grandfather or my father or something like that. I think there's an early self-published book in which she describes, her first yoga practice in the Mysore Shala of Joyce as being almost a revelatory, even erotic experience. And I think that's sort of deeply conflictual when this news comes out later. So we're often talking about people who are really, really struggling to come to grips with something that they have idealized for a long time. And one of the defensive things that people would say was that, if you're criticizing Pattabhi Jois's behavior, you must also be disrespecting the larger project of yoga or its traditions. And it's just, it would be like saying, if you want to criticize those, or if you want to indict those Catholic priests for child sexual abuse, we want you to know that you are really harming Catholic doctrine through the ages. You're really messing with the holy deposit of faith and the liturgy. You better be careful about that. It's a pretty common defensive thing, and somewhat of a conspiracy theory as well, because it's suggesting that, the reason that you want to pursue this person is because you don't like their religion, or you don't like, or this gets very complicated. Sometimes accusations of anti-Indian or racist or colonialist bias will come up as well, and that's a complicated issue that I think has to be faced head on. So yeah, there are defensive statements about that, but the notion that there is a kind of authentic yoga to protect is also kind of a stressful idea because pretty much everything in the modern yoga world is syncretic, reinvented. A lot of it is aspirational. I mean, when Mark Singleton came out with a book called Yoga Body in 2010, everybody freaked out because he presented this meticulous research that showed that Tirumalai Krishnamacharya and all of the patriarchs in that sort of layer of the modern yoga movement were likely more influenced by European calisthenics than anything that had been practiced continually in ashrams, dating back to the Middle Ages. So, one cynical view is that the trappings of religion and spirituality, and specifically Hinduism, although yoga has always been practiced interdenominationally in India, that those trappings do this very important work of making modern fitness influences seem ancient, authentic, and spiritual. I think that actually the less solid content there is in relation to medieval hatha yoga sources, the more mystification grew up around Joyce's technique. Like, he even started to claim that his posture routines had come from this ancient book that only Tirumalai Krishnamacharya and he had seen, and that the text had been bound up with a copy of the Patanjali Yoga Sutras in some dusty library in Calcutta, but of course it crumbled into dust, or it was eaten by ants, or he's lost it in his library or something like that. But it became this magical book that no one had ever seen, but it was also the root text of the culture. And to me, it's just a little bit tragic, because I don't think anybody needs any ancient authentication to contemplate the great mysteries of life. Like, unless you're paranoid that you're somehow going to get it all wrong, like you're going to get yoga wrong. Like, that's the anxiety. to appeal to ancient sources endlessly is a real, it's a sign of anxiety. And I think it betrays an inability or unwillingness to just trust one's own instincts and just practice in the basic flow of things.
Sorry about that, Matthew. I had my mic muted.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah, I was just going to say or add a comment that also yoga is traditionally quite an oral tradition where there's that relationship between teacher and student, and spending time with the gurus, living alongside them is a huge part of the learning process and development of discrimination.
Absolutely. And there's a whole other sort of hour that we could take to discuss how visual epistemology disrupts all of that. Oral instruction was sort of the ground zero of how breathing techniques, meditation techniques, and postural techniques were communicated in the pre-modern era. But as soon as you have photographs, I mean, we complain about yoga on Instagram now, but that started in the 1920s and even earlier, where suddenly yoga was something that you could watch somebody do or that you could be seen doing. And that brings a whole level of weirdness to things, because suddenly you're not as concentrated on internal sensation. You're not as concentrated on what things feel like. I don't know that anybody ever asked BKS Iyengar when he was learning yoga, okay, so what does that feel like? He was obsessed with orienting every hair of his body in the correct position so that the posture could be perfect, and somehow that would mean something. Somehow his body would become a conductor for enlightened magic or something like that. So yeah, I mean, the oral tradition is real, and it was a very different way of learning, and I think we're still sort of grappling with the fallout from that.
Yeah. Just a quick reminder for our live audience, we're going to get to some of your questions for Matthew in not too long here. So go ahead. I see they're already coming in on the comments on YouTube. Matthew, one of the things that you make really clear throughout the book is that the most important thing we can do is support the survivors or victims of not only Joyce's abuse, but of any cult or high demand group.
Yeah.
And I'm going to quote you again here. You write, "To say that a person has a quote unquote victim mentality has become a pious insult disguised as care. The insult suggests that the after effects of a crime are in the victim's perceptions only, and therefore theirs alone to repair. This is unjust and untrue." So I wonder if we can clarify this term victim in the context that you're using it.
Yeah. So early on in the research process, Karen Rain, who's one of the central interviewees in the book, pointed out to me that the term victim is actually a legal term. This is the term that we use for a person who another person has injured. So that's not a mentality. It's a material fact. And, the phrase victim mentality, I think, does the work of many of our more reactionary impulses, which seek to blame and shame the person who's speaking out about a material fact. And of course, this happens with women all the time in rape culture landscapes. And I hope that everyone can hear the kind of right-wing political smugness of the phrase victim mentality, because it's the suggestion that you're not really a victim of anything unless you pretend to be, which of course means that we don't need to take care of you, right? Now, that is not to say that the victim of a crime can't get stuck in a kind of pattern in which, diminished self-perception, reasonably diminished self-perception, becomes part of the problem. But that is a private issue. it's between that person and their therapist. So there's just no world in which it's appropriate to call that out crudely from a distance, to accuse somebody of having a victim mentality when in fact they have been injured. And what you may be doing by bypassing that is just abdicating your responsibility for care.
Yeah, thank you for that. Last week we had a guest, IU Peter, who's an Inuit elder and lawyer and activist,
Yeah.
as well as my teacher, Yogacharini Maitre. And one of the questions from the audience was really using that victim term when we're talking about the intergenerational impacts of colonization on Indigenous people. And it comes up so often, so it's really important to address.
Oh, for sure. For sure. It's a very, I mean, I think, settler colonial culture has to consistently invent ways of dodging responsibility. And that's a primary, that's a catchphrase.
Yeah. Before we get to audience questions, I want to just touch on, because at the end of this book, you provide a way forward and lots of wonderful solutions and reflective questions. Can we just touch on the PRISM model and how we can apply it a little bit?
Yeah. So PRISM is an acronym for a process of self-reflection that I think anybody who is investing themselves in a spiritual organization can apply to really sort of sort out what they're getting involved in. This came out of, really understanding that abuse within yoga organizations, Buddhist meditation organizations, New Age and wellness groups is really not uncommon. In fact, it's kind of the norm. The number of yoga schools, for instance, that have unresolved abuse crises is actually really long. And so, if you do enough journalism on it, if you get enough emails from people who are describing horrible, toxic circumstances, you start to recognize that, oh, this is a feature. It's not a bug. And it's not like that makes the yoga, wellness, Buddhist worlds somehow extraordinary. It just means that they're part of, the regular capitalist matrix. But the exception is, or the difference is that these are organizations that market themselves as being somehow above and beyond those contingencies. And so that is a primary illusion to just dispel right off the top. And you can do that with, the first step, which is the P step. It's pause, and to reflect on the fact that, every organization is going to have unresolved issues. And, this is a really great thing to do when you're in the throes of, the flush of excitement of a new practice or a new community. And you're in the sort of honeymoon or idealization stage where, everything is changing your life and you can't believe your luck and all of this stuff. The R is to research the group, is to really dig into, where does it come from? What is its, what are its instruments of authentication? Where does it say that it takes its authority from? And, where will you find information about historically how its members have been treated? Now, if you go farther with that, you get to the I, which is to, do a little bit of investigation into, well, how does this organization, how does it deal with its own issues? What kind of transparency structures does it have set up? What kind of complaint process or does it have any kind of HR responsiveness at all? Now, maybe it's because it's almost 11 o'clock here in Toronto, but I'm trying to remember, what's the S again?
Oh, the S is for a show.
Oh yeah, right. So this is really advice for people who are invested enough in a spiritual organization or a meditation group that they're beginning to work within it and perhaps even professionalize within it. And the show, and the M, model, are both components of figuring out how you are going to take the history that you understand as being integral to the group in all of its joy and trouble, and how are you going to show not only your fellow group members, but also model for the public what what an equitable, fair, and safe set of group practices might be. So yeah, it's just a tool of reflection that takes the edge off of idealization and perhaps a little bit of naivety. And yeah, I'm hoping that people who are younger than me won't even need it, because they'll be a little bit more skeptical, and their critical faculties will be more developed than my own were.
In part, much thanks to the work you're doing.
Well, maybe so.
Yeah. We're gonna take some audience questions, if that's okay with you, Matthew.
Sure, for sure.
There's one here from Tara, who says, was there a purer, more authentic yoga before the influence of Western colonialism?
It's a great question. Yeah. I would say many different types, but so it's not so much. I would be careful about the word pure, because of the many different lineages and and regional varieties of yoga practice in pre-colonial India. There was a lot of competition. There was a lot of argumentation about who has the clearer philosophy, or who has the more plausible steps of meditation towards a particular goal. Yoga is a very raucous discourse through the centuries, with competing texts, different perspectives on the nature of the body, different attitudes towards family life versus ascetic or monastic life. So we're talking about a very diverse, vibrant culture that, yes, when it meets colonialism, first undergoes alienation and isolation and suppression. There's actually there's a law in the 1860s that's passed by the British. I think it's called the India Arms Act, and it actually names as one of the groups from whom firearms will be restricted, it names yogis, which gives you the sense that, well, there are bands of yogis out there who are willing to arm themselves against the Raj. Very vibrant, dynamic discourse going on. And then as the influence of nationalistic projects of physical education begin to become more prominent at the beginning of the 20th century, that's when we have the kind of narrowing down of the notion of what yoga practice is to these very sort of operational, fitness and health and wellness based elements, along with a kind of I wouldn't say vestiges, but spiritual elements attached to them. But the style is the style of public schooling, and that's very different from what existed in pre-colonial times.
Thank you. And thanks, Tara, for that question. There's one from Sabina here who says, the Beatles' journey to India was big news for so many of their fans. Today, does Taylor Swift have a similar cult-like influence on her followers, indeed on business and politics?
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is where the fluidity of the term cult becomes really interesting, and I think troubling. Celebrity influence, I think, is the product of entire economies that are driving, wealth accumulation into a very few sets of hands. And, in that sense, there's absolutely exploitation going on. There's a kind of premise of universalism as well. Like everybody should love, the last Swift album or something like that. And if you don't get it or something like that. You're not on the inside of this very valuable part of the culture. But as far as I can tell, I'm not really a Swift scholar, but as far as I can tell, the influences seem fairly benign. I mean, unless what we want from our pop stars is a stronger form of feminism, yeah, I guess I would want to make a distinction between the influence of celebrity pop culture and then the much more kind of direct and operational influence that Maharishi Mahesh had over his generation, including the Beatles, which was much more about how should people behave. I don't think Taylor Swift really cares about how people should behave. I don't think her handlers care either. I don't think she has a program for the world, So, but definitely, I would agree that there's something strange going on with a cult of personality that is so extraordinarily successful.
Interesting question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sabina. I think we have time for one more here. This is from Lara. Another interesting question. Is it true that there is only one true lineage left, that of Muktananda and Guri Maya? I don't know those two names myself. The others have been contaminated due to a loss of true leadership.
Well, I'm sorry to be the one who informs you that yes, Swami Muktananda of Siddha Yoga and his successor Gurumai have their own very well documented abuse histories. And if the listener wasn't aware of that, I apologize for bearing bad news. The person who's, the sort of analytical expert on that is Dan Shaw. His book, Traumatized Narcissism, looks pretty closely at his experience within the Siddha Yoga ashram. And yeah, tons of eyewitness and direct survivor reports of Muktananda abusing children. So I mean, I would not call it a one true lineage of anything. Yeah, I'm sorry. Not a great note to end on, I'm afraid.
Well, here's a maybe a good note to end on.
Okay, right.
Maybe an easier question to answer too. from Ron. Do you believe that there are true and good enlightened gurus?
I believe that there are true and good people. I'm not so sure about the enlightenment part. I don't know, after being immersed in this for so long, I don't really know what the threshold is, what the measurement would be, what I could learn from somebody who was enlightened versus not enlightened. I believe that there are many, many, maybe even most people who are trying their damnedest to see things clearly, to be kind, to think deeply about our predicaments, and to do the best they can. I think, Ron, if you're asking, do I believe that anybody in the yoga or wellness or the Buddhist worlds has the answer, or sort of attain some kind of state that's exalted? Not really. I think that there are some people who have been extraordinarily interesting, artistic, charismatic, and also profoundly troubled. I mean, the person that comes to mind most prominently that way, who I think really, brings the whole package, is Chogyam Trungpa, who was obviously a polymath and an extraordinarily creative person, and also a complete disaster as a human being, leaving a trail of human wreckage behind him. And so, yeah, if your question is about, are there particular people who attain things, I think whatever those particular people attain, it's pretty mixed. And as for the rest of us, I think a lot of us are good and true.
That's a really nice note to end on, Matthew. We've been speaking to Matthew Remski. His new book is Surviving Modern Yoga, Cult Dynamics, Charismatic Leaders, and What Survivors Can Teach Us. You can get it at banyan.com. Matthew's website is matthewremski.com. You can also check out his Conspirituality podcast. Matthew, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ross. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.